President once.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's special event. That includes those of you here in person and also those watching online and on Channel 8. I am Commerce City Mayor Pro Tem and Ward 2 Councilmember Jennifer Allen Thomas. I'm also a member of the city's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Commission. On behalf of the city and the DEI Commission, I'd like to welcome you to this special celebration in honor of Black History Month. I would like to thank the mayor, fellow city council members, city staff, and the DEI Commission, and especially Commission member Doreen Armelin in assisting to make this event a reality. I would first also like to recognize our present council members that are present with us this evening. I have Council Member Susan Noble, and if you can stand for a second. Thank you. I have Council Member Christy Douglas. Thank you. And I have Council Member Craig Kim. And also in our audience who made this a reality also is our City Manager, Jason Rogers. Thank you. We are honored to be joined this evening by heritage members of the Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated to recognize and learn more about an extraordinary chapter in American history through the eyes of those who lived it. Whether you're familiar with this history or here tonight to learn it for the first time, we are proud to shine a light on their accomplishments in celebration of Black History Month. Now, to begin this evening's event, I would like to introduce Ms. Gabrielle Martin, a heritage member of the Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated and daughter of retired Lieutenant Colonel James Harvey. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here, whether you're here in person or joining us through one of our video mechanisms. We're glad that you have an interest in the story of these legendary military airmen and the village it took to raise them up. So we're going to share with you tonight some stories, because stories have such an impact on us all, whether they educate us, provide information. One of the important things that stories do is they help us preserve events, and we want to preserve the legacy of these airmen. So tonight, in several forms, you're going to hear stories of these airmen who fought to fight for this country, our country, even though at the time they were entering service, this country did not value them or think them capable of flying in combat. So we hope you enjoy the presentation. We are going to start tonight with a video from Lieutenant Colonel Harvey, who is unable to be with us, but wanted to share a special message with you.
Good evening. I go by Harvey. In the military, I was known as Colonel Harvey. Hello and welcome to this Black History Month event sponsored by the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Commission of Commerce City. Thank you for inviting me to participate. I'm sorry I cannot attend in person. This evening you will see my Top Gun video and I hope you enjoy it. I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening as well.
So Lieutenant Colonel Harvey is one of the last what we call DOTAs, or documented original Tuskegee Airmen, here in our Colorado chapter, and we will see his video shortly. But first, we're going to have a reenactment. John Thomas, who is a member of our chapter, long-serving, so he served in a number of positions, does a reenactment for us. John was called to reenact by another friend of ours who saw him doing a reenactment for another group and said, he is spot on. So please welcome John as he does a reenactment for us this evening.
Is my mic on? Spot on. Ma'am, sir, I am a Tuskegee Airman. I am proud to be a Tuskegee Airman, proud to represent my country, proud to fight for your freedom, and proud to pave the way for Negroes to have meaningful careers in the military. I put my life on the line every day, fighting in the war. You would think when we got back home that everything would have been great, but that was not always the case. Now, for me, it started when I was a kid. I had a 6-airplane air base in my yard. I flew those planes every day. I'd see airplanes going up in the sky and say, yeah, I want to be up there one day flying an airplane. My mom and daddy used to bring us to church every Sunday and pack a picnic lunch, and we'd go to the airport and sit at the end of the runway and watch the planes take off and land. And I just sat there saying, yeah, I want to be a pilot one day. I was a good student, got good grades in school, I behaved, and I did all the right things, but I also loved to work with my hands. You know, I took things apart. I mean, I took everything apart. My mama told my daddy one day, don't you give that boy no watch. All he's going to do is take it apart. Well, he did, and I did. He just walked by the table laughing. That came in handy for me later on because I needed to understand how things worked. And as a pilot, I understood airplanes very well. And later in my career, I actually became an aircraft crash investigator. When they had a problem and couldn't figure out why a plane crashed, they would call me. So what you learn when you're a kid sometimes pays off very handsomely. Now I went to junior high school, went on to high school, and had some friends who worked at a hotel next to a military air base. And they helped me get a job as a busboy. And I used to love to go there because I'd see the soldiers come in, they'd be walking with their pinks and greens, and I'd look and say, yeah, you know, that's what I want to be. And I knew a few of them. So we'd sit down and talk, and we'd talk about flying, what it meant to fly, to make mistakes. And I just got more encouraged than ever. I went on to college and got my degree and said, you know, I'm going to join the Army so I can be a pilot. So I marched down to the recruiting office and said, I want to sign up. So they signed me up, and I said, oh, by the way, I want to be a pilot. And they looked at me, and they laughed. Said, Negroes can't be pilots. I said, what are you talking about? But that was true. Now, the Army had a problem. Back in 1925, the Army College did a study after World War I. And they concluded that Negroes were inferior, intellectually inferior, were cowardly, couldn't fight, and would desert on a moment's notice. And asked my friends, who did they interview? None of my friends would do anything like that. So the Army just had that negative attitude. Now, in the late 1930s and early 1940s, there were Negro pilots commercially, women and men. So we had to ask the question, why is the Army not allowing Negroes to fly? Mary McLeod Bethune, as well as Eleanor Roosevelt, President Roosevelt's wife, clamored, as well as the NAACP, to get the Army to allow Negroes to fly. And, Eleanor got her way, and Teddy said, okay, we're going to let Negroes fly. So they set up an experiment. Again, the Army was a negative attitude about Negroes flying. So they set up the school, and they set it up for failure. They did not want us to succeed. So at first, there were a lot of Negro pilots, but then they asked white pilots to come in to make it difficult for us to learn to fly. Now, white pilots had to learn navigation and gunnery. Well, here we go with the Army again. We had to learn navigation, gunnery, and aerobatics. Aerobatics. Well, that backfired on the Army. Because you know what happened? We knew how to push those planes to a limit. We could do somersaults, fly up and down. We'd fly circles around our enemy pilots. Now, the first graduating class finished in 1941. And in that class was a fellow by the name of Benjamin O. Davis. Davis was the son of a Negro general in the Army who was a general in late 1930s. So, there was Army blood running through his body. Now, he was tough as nails. He graduated from West Point. And do you know, in the 4 years he attended West Point, not a single one of his classmates said a word to him. Can you imagine how difficult that must have been? But he was tough as nails. And he went on to be the commander of the 332nd Fighter Group, which is the all-Negro fighter group. The first class at Tuskegee also had a washout rate of 40%, which means 60% of the guys graduated. And the Army's going crazy. Said, well, we can't have that because at the white school, 60% of them washed out. So they said, well, get the Negroes out of the school. I don't care what you do. I mean, they do things like fly in a circle, a mile wide, bank the airplane 50 degrees, and they'd set the speed of the plane that I had to fly at just above the stall rate. So if I was too low, I'd crash. I mean, they dismiss us for anything. Missed assignments, not passing tests, not having shoes shined, or cleanliness, or whatever. It didn't matter. So they got the rate up, the failure rate at Tuskegee, up to 72%, and they were happy with that. But we persevered. World War II started, or had started, and we had several battalions and squadrons, at least, in Northern Africa. But the main one was the 332nd Fighter Group, managed by General Davis in Ramitelli in Italy. Now, we had assignments to fly in the war, but they were meaningless assignments. They'd tell us, go take out a bridge, and we get there, and the white pilots have already taken it out. Go bomb this train. And we get there, and the white pilots had already bombed the train. Go do a beach patrol. And we find out the white pilots had already done the beach patrol. So we really wanted to have some meaningful assignments, and Davis was really unhappy about that. Now, back in the States, there was a few people in Congress and in society who wanted to kill the Tuskegee experiment. So they asked Davis to come back and refute some of their charges. And one of them, when he testified, he said, look, we're not doing anything over there because you're not giving us any meaningful assignments. Give us something to do. So he refuted all the claims, and he said, give us something that we can be proud to do. Now, understand that the Army had a really big problem with the bombers. The bombers were big, they were slow, they carried lots of bombs, and they were sitting ducks. Now, the rule was when they flew missions, they'd be escorted by squadrons of fighter planes. Now, the white pilots would escort, and the Germans would send up a squadron to fight the bombers. Well, the white pilots would say, oh, we're going to go get some kills. So they peel off and chase the German pilots because they wanted to kill pilots so they could get the ace classification. Well, the Germans were smart. They'd send up 2 squadrons. The first to get the pilots to peel off and chase them, and the second squadron would come up and just knock the bombers out of the sky. The bombers got 10, 15 people on it, not just one plane. So the Army said, okay, Davis, you want a job? Escort the bombers. And Davis said, okay, we'll do that, but you better give us new planes because all these hand-me-down planes you've given us don't work well. So we got brand new P-51 aircraft, and we wanted to do something to make them distinctive. So we painted the tails red, and that's why we became known as the Red Tails. So we get the planes. David, on the first mission we were to go on, Davis calls the group in the briefing room and said, look, we've got a chance to prove that we're worthy of being pilots. We're going to escort the bombers, and we're going to meet at a certain point. And by the way, if any one of you pilots deserts or leaves the bombers, I will personally court-martial you. Now, how's that for a send-off? You know? So on our first mission, escorting the bombers, we didn't lose a single plane. Germans came up, and a few of us would peel off and fight with them and chase them off, but we didn't lose a single bomber. Next mission, a very similar thing happened. Pretty soon, and you know, the bomber squadron leaders, they didn't know who we were. All they saw was these planes escorting them with red tails. And they said, well, we want the red tail group to escort my mission. So everybody wanted us, and they started calling us the Red Tail Angels. We were bad, we were tough. I remember the longest mission that we flew, which was to Berlin from Ramentelli. There's a fellow from Chicago called Lucky Lester. Well, Lucky Lester shot down 3 German Messerschmitts in 5 minutes. And the story he tells is that, you know, I'm up at 29,000 feet, and the Germans come up, and a few of us peel off, and I get behind one of them, and I shoot him. And he explodes, and I duck to the side to try to not be hit by the shrapnel and debris. And lo and behold, there's another Messerschmitt right in front of me. So I shoot him down, and he crashes. And then I go down low to about 1,000 feet, trying to find the rest of the bombers and the squadron. And lo and behold, there's another Messerschmitt. So within the span of 5 minutes, he kills 3 German Messerschmitts. Now, we were good pilots. We knew how to handle those planes. We shot down the Germans came up with the first jet fighter. Now, that's pretty hot stuff, right? Well, our little P-51 propeller plane, we knocked down several of those jet planes. After the war, there were some debriefings of German pilots, and they said, look, you know, if we came up to get the bombers and we saw that the escorts were red tails, we went the other way. They didn't want to fight with us. They knew how good we were. So the war ended, and we did so well, and here's the Army again being negative with Negroes. They kept records of all the missions ever flown by all the pilots, but they classified the record of the 332nd Fighter Group as top secret, and it wasn't released. Those records weren't released until 1995. That's how predatory they were. So the war is over, and we as Negroes were stationed in different places throughout the country, and we said, look, you know, we're officers, but the quarters here are segregated. We couldn't go to the officers' club. So we decided to dress up in our dress suits, and we marched to the officers' club, and we went in. We were the first people to do sit-ins. And the white pilots in there that knew us welcomed us with open arms. But the managers called the military police. So they came and they arrested us, put us in the barracks. But you know, the next day, the commanders released us. And Truman heard about that. And he had also heard a lot of people say that we should integrate the armed services. So in 1948, he did. He issued an executive order that integrated the armed services. And that started mainly with the formation of the Air Force, which were formed in 1948. All the pilots from all the other organizations were put under the Air Force. And you know what? All the commanders of the bases wanted the Tuskegee Airmen pilots and the ground crews because we knew how to fix airplanes. They gave us crappy airplanes. We had to fix them. We couldn't use duct tape and bubble gum. We had to really fix them, and we did. So everybody wanted our pilots and everybody wanted our ground crews. That's how good we were. Now the Air Force was formed, and the commanders decided, well, we should have a competition to see who's the best. So they sent out a memorandum to all the bases all over the world and said, we're going to have a competition, a gunnery competition in Las Vegas, Nevada. And send your best people, and we'll see who the best of the best is. So Colonel Davis called 4 of us into his office. He said, look, you guys are the best pilots we have. You're going to go to Las Vegas. And by the way, if you don't win, don't come back. I mean, he was tough. So 4 of us went. We had 3 primary pilots and 1 alternate just in case something happened. So we went to Las Vegas. The competition was aerial gunnery at 12,000 feet, aerial gunnery at 20,000 feet, rocket firing, skip bombing, dive bombing, and panel strafing. Each one of those competitions was on 1 day at a time. Now, the rules of the competition were that if you have a problem with your aircraft, you don't fly that day. So remember that. So, end of the first day, we get 6 rockets, 6 bombs into the first day. Our group, the team, there are 2 awards being given out: individual best pilot and also team best pilots. Into the first day, all of us, the 3 of us, got 6 out of 6. So we were leading. Into the second day, 6 out of 6. Third day, 6 out of 6. The Army commanders were going crazy. We can't let Negroes win. So on the last day of the competition, the white pilot who was in first place had trouble with his plane. Well, not only did they give him a new plane, they had to have given him more ammunition because there's no way he could have scored as high as he did. So they stole the individual Top Gun award away from us. But we won the team award. Can you believe it? A trophy this big, the 3 of us. I mean, we won. And you'll hear more about that tonight. But we're pretty proud of that. Now, the Air Force issues an almanac every year and lists all kinds of figures and facts about the Air Force. And it lists the winners of the Top Gun competition every year. But the winner of the 1949 competition was unknown. And that didn't change until 1995 when somebody questioned the Air Force about that, and they corrected that. In addition to that, nobody knew where the trophy was. A tenacious reporter named Zellie Orr out of Atlanta found the trophy. Said, where's that trophy? She found the trophy in a week at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in a closet in the back in a box that said, do not open. So she marched up front and said, why is that trophy not in display? So guess where it is now? It's on display at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Now, the Air Force was formed, and we all went our different ways and had different kinds of careers, and we always we were not trying to show anybody else up. We're not trying to prove we were better than anybody else. All we wanted to do was to show that we could do the job. I was pretty successful. Every time I got a new commander, a new assignment, my boss was always a little skeptical, but I very shortly proved to him that not only was I a good worker, I was a damn good pilot. I was checked out actually on 31 different aircraft. And I remember flying, later in my career, an F-111. F-111 is capable of Mach 2.475. So I'm up there over the desert, and I'm flying this 111, and I'm saying, I want to see what this baby can do. So I it's got 5 afterburners, and I'm kicking them all in, and I get to Mach 2.4, and my radio starts going crazy. Hey, what are you doing up there? Get your butt down here on the ground. Anyway, that was a nice experience. But I tell you what, that P-51 was my favorite plane to fly. We call it the hot rod of airplanes. That 525 horsepower, 12-cylinder engine purred like a kitten, and we could do all kinds of things with it. So I continued in my career. I fought in the Korean War. Vietnam War came up, and we challenged and threatened or flirted with death all the time. Well, in Vietnam, I actually came pretty close to losing it. So I'm leading a squadron of 5 airplanes, and we're going to go take out a bridge over here. So I go down, I'm lead, I drop my bombs, and I'm coming up, and I hear this thump, and I look back, and there's smoke coming out of the back of my aircraft. So, oh boy, I'm in trouble. I look back, and the plane is kind of lifting to the left, and I couldn't straighten it out. And I look, and I'm losing my primary controls. And then my secondary controls went out. And I said, oh, I better get out of this, baby. So I pulled the lever and ejected. And I'm spinning like crazy, because you come in a jet fighter, you're going at a pretty high speed. But they teach us to go, spread eagle to straighten out. I did that, pulled my parachute, and started to glide towards the woods over there. Now I'm looking back. I got my parachute on. I'm looking back. I can see the Viet Cong chasing my plane. My plane's burning. But luckily for me that day, it was windy. And the wind blew me to the forest over here in the hills. So I finally get down, bundle up my chute, hide it away, and run for the hills. And I'm a little frightened, because they're after me. They're chasing me with guns. So I hunker down, get on my radio and tell them, radio the base and say, hey, these are my coordinates. Come get me. Say, okay, we'll be there in about 30 minutes or so. I pull out my Bible. My grandma gave me my Bible. I'm reading the 23rd Psalm, and I'm just trembling away. Anyway, 2 hours later, I hear the chopper coming. So I try to communicate with the chopper, and everything starts to go wrong. I can't talk to them. So I had to radio the base, and they radioed the chopper. So they finally located me, and they're coming down, and I run out, and they grab me, and they get 15 feet off the ground, and they drop me. I fall backwards and hurt my back, and it still hurts today. And they come back down again, and they got me up this time, second time. So I'm happy as a clam. I'm crying. I'm hugging everybody I can. I'm saved, I'm saved, I'm saved. And I noticed that there's water in my shoe, and I look down, and it's blood. And I got a hole in my leg, the size of my finger. So anyway, I had to spend a little while in the hospital, but I recovered. But that was too close for comfort. I went ahead and continued my career, and I formed some good friendships with people. A German, actually, believe it or not, a Frenchman, and another Englishman. And every couple, 3 years, we get together someplace over in Europe. And, we formed some really good bonds and good friends. Now, later in my career, I had a reporter ask me, what's the best thing and the worst thing that happened to you? Well, the best thing that happened to me was winning the Top Gun competition. The worst thing was coming back on the troop ship after the war, walking down the gangplank, and I see 2 signs. One that says, whites this way, and coloreds this way. I put my life on the line every day. So I ask you, when will it be when we will have done enough to be treated as equals? Sir, ma'am, thank you.
John, before you go back, do you want to tell folks quickly how you put together your reenactment, what you did?
I guess it's about 10 years ago, the National Association of Buffalo Soldiers had a convention here in Denver, and I was a part of a reenactment group, and they asked us to do something at the convention. So we decided to do a conversation between a Buffalo soldier and a Tuskegee Airman, 100 years apart, same issues. And I played the part of the Airman. And I wasn't part of the Tuskegee chapter at the time, but Mark Dickerson and John Porsche called me and they said, John, we got this problem, all our guys are dying. In 1972, there were 19 Colorado designated original Tuskegee Airmen. Today, there's only one. That's James Harvey. So the comment was, look, we need somebody to embody what the airmen did. So I interviewed James Randall, who was actually the guy that got shot down in Vietnam. Frank Macon. Frank is the guy who took everything apart when he was a kid became a flight crash investigator, and James Harvey. I tell you, I sit down and talk to those guys, and he said, John, you know, in 1942, on December 3rd at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I met with someone. I can't remember what I did yesterday, you know. I mean, these guys are precise. Anyway, so I work with them, and I put together a little presentation, and that's kind of what you saw. So that's the way it happened.
All right.
Any questions? Or?
We're going to take questions later.
Okay.
So thank you,
Okay.
John. We just want to give people a sense that there's a whole lot to that. It's not just one person. And now, as John said, we're going to see Lieutenant Colonel Harvey in his own words about the Top Gun competition. But I do need to make a correction. I'll talk to you later about it. My father was Captain Robert Martin. Lieutenant Colonel Harvey and his family are out of town, being one of the last living originals. He is in high demand, particularly during Black History Month. So he was gracious enough to let me come by and make that little video thanking you for your interest in him. But now we'll hear it, the story in his own words, and actually see some of the footage.
Fighter pilots like to fly low and fast. We were the original Top Gun. Our competitors, they didn't think we were for real. We were black and we were flying this obsolete aircraft. We weren't supposed to win it.
We had heard that there was no official recognition. We were trying to right a wrong that was over 70 years in the making.
You put your mind to something, you can accomplish it. I was standing in my front yard out where we lived out in the woods. I saw a flight of P-40s flying over in formation. And I said, I'd like to do that one day. So I was drafted into the Army. They sent me to Fort Belvoir, Virginia. And the mission was to go into the jungles of the South Pacific, doze out an area, and build an airfield for aircraft to operate from. And we used to go out and practice every day, and all this dust and sweat. And I said, no, this isn't for me. So I applied for cadet training. I was accepted, went off to Bowling Field, Washington, D.C. area. There were 9 whites and myself. 2 of us passed. And then from there to Alabama for pilot training.
Here for the first time, Negro aviation cadets were being groomed to fly warplanes. You who stand here before me now are considered forerunners in the movement which has given you a place in the fighting men of the sky.
Since everything was segregated, the Army said we will put the flying school for the Negro pilots at Tuskegee, Alabama. They built a special airfield for us to get our basic and advanced training. I was a perfectionist. Everything has to be perfect. So, instructor give me maneuvers to practice. I practice until I nailed it. Flying is great. It's great. You're up there in that machine all by yourself. You're in complete control. You can't screw up. No room for error. None. I was the best at what I did. I completed my combat training in April of 1945. That's when I became part of the 332nd Fighter Group, later known as the Tuskegee Airmen. Had my bags packed to get on a ship to go over and join the group. And we got a message saying to hold us. The war in Italy was over and they expected to wind up the whole European theater.
The forces of Germany have surrendered. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe.
But the truth is, he knew I was coming. And so he threw in the towel the following month. In January 1949, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force sent a directive out to all the fighter groups in the United States. They were to pick their 3 high scorers to represent their group at the first ever Top Gun weapons meet. So based on our scores, Captain Temple, First Lieutenant Harry Stewart, and myself were chosen as primary members, and First Lieutenant Halbert Alexander as an alternate member. Before we left, we had a meeting with our commander, and he said, if you don't win, don't come back. We as a race of people who weren't expected to do anything. Everything was negative. The only thing left for us to do is go out and win this meet. The weapons meet was held at Las Vegas Air Force Base, known today as Nellis Air Force Base. The competition consisted of aerial gunnery, panel strafing, dive bombing, skip bombing, and rocket firing. Our competitors were flying the P-51 and the P-82, which was the latest things in the Air Force inventory as far as aircraft go. They were lighter, do tight turns, and that's what you need when you're doing air-to-air combat. We were flying the obsolete P-47, but it didn't matter, though. It's the skill of the pilot that determines what's going to happen. They were there to compete, and we were there to win. The first day, we have aerial gunnery, the tow ship towing a target. We didn't have any gun sights, so you use the nose of the aircraft. You put your nose in front of the target. How far in front of that target do I put my nose? That's the key. You squeeze your trigger, and you target, and the bullets meet at the same time out in space there. You give me a job to do, I go and do the job. The next day, panel strafing. It's very simple. Panel strafing is that you fire at this panel that's set up on the ground. You come in at about a 30-degree angle. You line up on it. You got the right picture. You pull the trigger, and you hit it. The next day, we have dive bombing. Dive bombing, you come over your target about 12,000 feet, roll it over, drop straight down, line up on the target, release your bombs, and pull out by 2,000 feet. You can become fixated on that target. You forget your altitude, or approaching that ground fast, and pull out too late and mush into the ground. So you want to make sure you pull out well in advance. No one did good that day. Now, the next day we have skip bombing. Now, skip bombing, you come in very low to the ground, your propeller clearing the ground by about a foot. And you're so low that when you release your bombs, they don't have a chance to nose over yet. So they hit flat, skip through the target. What I did, come up on the target. When the target went below my nose, I released my bombs. They hit the ground flat, skip through the target. We had a perfect score, 6 for 6, each of us. The next day, it's our final mission of rocket firing. My vision is the target, and that's it. Then we fire the rockets, because they're below the wings. And you see the rockets go, and they hit the target. We were related, we won. It was very intense. No one expected us to win. And when it was announced that we, the 332nd, had won the trophy, the room was quiet. There was no applause or anything like that, because we weren't supposed to win it. Little did I know that this was the last time the public would see the trophy for 55 years. Our victory was swept under the rug.
We had been working with the local Tuskegee chapter when we first heard about Colonel Harvey's story. We had heard that the 332nd Fighter Group received no official recognition for their win at Nellis Air Force Base in 1949. Our mission at Wish of a Lifetime is to change the way our society views and values older adults by granting their lifelong wishes and sharing their stories to inspire those of all ages. And Lieutenant Colonel Harvey gives us a chance to right a wrong so many years later.
My wish was to go to Nellis Air Force Base and see us listed right at the top as far as the weapons meet skull.
We couldn't think of a more deserving group of individuals, so we immediately picked up the phone, started calling the military to see if we could get their victory recognized at Nellis Air Force Base. We were able to get a hold of the Air Force Association and work with them to come up with a way to commemorate the winners of the first Top Gun competition. And they came through big time for Colonel Harvey and the 332nd.
We're here to recognize today the initial Air Force worldwide fighter competition. The Tuskegee Airmen Squadron came here, and not only did they compete, but they won.
Today was quite an event. It proves that if you believe in something and you stay at it, you'll finally get the recognition you deserve. Now this plaque, finally, after many years, will be at the top, #1.
I have two footnotes to that story. I was able to attend on behalf of the chapter with Colonel Harvey and his daughters. That plaque that they have, the unfortunate part is the gunnery school remains at Nellis, but of course, it's in a building where there's no direct public access. It did get a lot of press, and if you know, you can call, and sometimes you can make arrangements and they will take you back to see the plaque. So it's good the recognition is there, but it's still kind of sad because the symbols of their win still kind of get hidden. As for Wright Patterson, I had a friend who's from Ohio text me last week. I thought you said they recognized who the Tuskegee Airmen and that they won. I'm here at the museum where the statues are, and there's still a little problem. So I say that to say we still have work to do, even as these gentlemen finally are getting their due recognition. And so for those of you here early, and you'll see it again a little later, I put together a little slide that really says the Tuskegee Airmen are here. They have done things. They are starting to get recognition. And so it's a little slide pack that plays showing places not only in America, but there's 2 overseas where there are memorials to the Tuskegee Airmen. Sometimes it's an airport, sometimes it's just a plaque or some other kind of stone edifice that recognizes them, but they are starting to get their recognition. As I said, I am the daughter of Captain Martin, and I'm going to share with you some other basic information. John covered a lot in his presentation. So he told you that in 1941, they had the first class. This is a picture that we get to use courtesy of John Mosley's family. And there's some information about him in the public places, and we've got a storyboard about him. His family has this picture, and they allow us to use it, showing the signing ceremony, which established the Tuskegee Airmen. This is their patch, their national emblem. Most chapters have their own emblem. These are the patches of the 332nd. So the 99th is in the bottom left corner, which was the original. Those are the guys that graduated in 91. The 100th is in the top right. You come over to the top left, the 301st, and the bottom right is the 302nd. So those were the single engine fighters. As John mentioned, there was another group, they're the 477th, and they flew twin engines, and they didn't even get to go overseas because the war was over. But I do want to mention them because they do exist. So they went over, and we know they fought. Race relations in this country were horrible. And when I first heard the story, I was like, why did you go? And my dad would say, you know, it was in the press. It was the beginning of civil rights. So we were fighting for a double victory. So that's why when they came off the boat, when they came back home, they were disheartened. We just helped win the war for America, and you're telling us we still have to go down a separate gangplank. So they signed up, they wanted progress, they wanted to prove them wrong. And my dad would say all the time, if it was already this bad and I did nothing, it could be worse. And I'm sure that many of the other airmen had that same sentiment. So we think of the Tuskegee Airmen, we often think of the pilots, but there was a lot more than just those single engine fighter pilots. So there was almost 1,000 trained, and look at how many others there were. This is the village that it took for those pilots to go overseas and do their jobs. And we don't want to forget about them because they say, you know, we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us. Those are the angel wings that kept them flying, kept them up there when they needed to parachute out, got them out. But of those pilots, fewer than 500 actually flew overseas with the 99th or the 332nd. So it was a very small number that actually flew. Part of it was a fight to get into the service. You couldn't just walk up and say, I want to be in. You had to take a test, and we know what happens with these standardized tests, right? We can skew it any way we want. So the first thing was you were supposed to have a college degree, but they couldn't get enough classes. Then the civil rights community was up in arms, and after Benjamin Davis got called back to Congress, they kind of started relaxing that. But many of the people were in college. Many of them were in engineering school, mathematicians, teachers, scientists, and they got in. So once they get in, John kept telling us, the Army has a way of saying, what are we going to do about this? So we're going to increase the washout rate for any reason, but there was other things they did. They chose training sites like Tuskegee because the South was hostile, and these gentlemen were literally held hostage on their bases because they risked being lynched, beaten, burned if they wandered off base. We already talked about the washout race. During the course of their training, they did not do all their training in Tuskegee. Some of them got sent north. And on days like today, do you think you're getting much flying time? No. So when John says you missed a test, you missed a deadline, oh, you didn't have your hours in, you can't pass your flight check? That's another way to wash them out. The equipment was to use planes, but then they got those P-51s, the new equipment, but that was an experiment. We'll see what they do with this. And when it was all said and done, the whole story about Davis having to come before Congress and make the case, we had to have permission to fight in combat. But that was a history of blacks in the military. We would get called, and you could be a cook, you could shine boots, you could take care of the horses, you could do whatever from the very first Indian Wars. But we had to have permission to have firepower to fight for our country. But they did a bang-up job They had the lowest loss record when they talk about escorting bombers. They flew over 1,500 missions, over 200 escort missions. They destroyed or damaged a ton of aircraft and ground units. So trains, trucks, depots, any place they stored fuel or munitions, they would go out strafing and destroy those things. But they paid a price. There were 32 POWs. 66 pilots lost their lives. And only the remains of one, Captain Lawrence Dixon, was actually recovered, and his remains came back to the States in the fall of 2018. Actually, they came in the spring of 2018. They confirmed that it was in fact him, and he is now buried in Arlington. I was able to attend that ceremony because he was a friend of my dad's. So for all those missions and all that work, what did they get? They got a lot of hardware. And because it was a classified, nobody knew about any of this stuff for the very longest time. 3 presidential unit citations, so extraordinary heroism. Another reason for them to say, oh no, we can't have this out, that these guys are actually competent. Legion of Merit, 1 Silver Star, 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses. Extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight. My dad is one of those 96. 744 air medals for aerial flight, 8 Purple Hearts. You lost some blood, you were wounded, or you died, unfortunately, and you were put in, and those get approved by the president. And then as a unit, they got the Congressional Gold Medal in 2007 for their unique record in escorting the bombers and inspiring the president, then Truman, to desegregate, at least on paper, the armed services. Let me skip to 26. And the unique thing about most of these guys is they fought to serve their country and they came home, and most of them had a life of service. They were teachers, instructors, they stayed in the military, earned higher ranks, taught others, kind of helped make the military career something that people were proud of. They didn't just go and come back and get forgotten about. So that's kind of the basics about the Tuskegee Airmen, how they got there, what they had to do to get there. And here we are in 2023, still talking about trying to get recognition for these guys who, like I said, talk about fighting the war, they had to fight just to get into the war. So we are going to move on, and I am going to share a conversation with another heritage member, and we use that term. We know what it means. It means we're a direct descendant of a original Tuskegee Airman. So usually the spouse. So I have with me tonight Miss Daphne Rice Allen. We're going to come up here on the stage and sort of talk to you about what it was like growing up with a parent who was a Tuskegee Airman. And remember the village, because everybody didn't do the same thing. There's a lot of different things that happened, but we'll talk to you about that. So you want to come on up? And I'm going to start by letting Daphne introduce herself, since I've been up and you know a little bit about me. So why don't you tell us who you are, who your parent was?
So my name is Daphne Rice Allen. I am the third daughter of Price Deallian Rice. He was the class of 1942I. So he was part of that first, or the experiment, if you would. Benjamin Davis did train him. And when they talk about the washout, that was very real. He said that there were 35 men that started out, and there were 8 that graduated. He came from Shelby, North Carolina. He is one of 4 boys and 2 girls. My father's great-grandfather was a slave. And so I have that history out of Shelby, North Carolina. And his mother took the children, wanted them to get good educations, and took them to New Jersey. My father met my mother at Tuskegee. My father, like Gabriel said, had a degree, a bachelor's degree from Springfield College, and enlisted. And the rigor was very real. And part of the reason I know some of that is because my dad kept his records in triplicate. When he passed away in 1999, he lived in a 2-bedroom, bath and a half townhouse that you would have thought was a 4-bedroom house. He just had that much artifact and that much information. But I have 2 older sisters, a younger sister. The oldest was born in Tuskegee. Second to the oldest sister was born in Washington, D.C. I was born in the Philippines, and my younger sister was born here in Colorado. Again, Daddy was 1942I through 1965, retired a colonel, remarried, moved to San Francisco, and put about another 15 years as the deputy director for the Bureau of Customs in San Francisco. So as Gabriel stated, not all, but most of the men stayed in and did incredible, incredible careers, and just were doing what they thought they were supposed to be doing.
Okay. And so my father had a little bit different tract, but again, from a large family in Iowa. There were 12 airmen from Iowa. He graduated with a degree in electrical engineering and a pilot's license. So when he applied to get into the Army Air Corps, he knew why he was going. He knew what he wanted to do. He knew he wanted to be a fighter pilot. And then he had to wait because they were trying to put together classes. And so the Army came along and said, well, you don't have that order. You better report or else. So he did a little stint in the Army, but finally his father was trying to help him, and they got word to Washington. So some paperwork went back to Fort Dodge in Iowa, and they were told, this guy belongs to us. You're going to get his paperwork, and he better be fit to report to training because he's going to be a pilot. And so my dad ended up with this cushy little job for 6-8 months in a file room. But then he got the call. He took a train from Iowa. As he would say, in his small town, there wasn't really segregation because they weren't going to build a school for one, a library for one, what have you. And while he had to know his place, life was much different than relatives who still lived in the South. So he got on the train, headed to Tuskegee, and when they got to a certain point down south, he had to get out of the train car and go to the back car because Negroes could not sit in the cars with whites. So he graduated in the class of 44A. So every year, classes graduated, and the letter denomination just tells you which class that was. So he was in the first class in 44 when he got his wings pinned. They got pinned as second lieutenants, and then they worked their way up. And I showed you that emblem of Tuskegee Airmen, Inc. After the war, my dad was very influential in getting guys to meet. They had their first quote-unquote convention in Chicago in 1954. They weren't Tuskegee Airmen, Inc., but they would meet. They called themselves the Dodos because y'all know the dodos are now extinct, but the birds couldn't fly, right? So they said, we're going to name ourselves and sort of thumb their nose in it. Because not only did we fly, we had a great thing. So finished the war, ultimately did a ton of crazy jobs because nobody was hiring Black engineers, but went on to a life of service with the city of Chicago, designing street lighting systems. That was his thing, power management and lighting. So he married and had 4 kids, and here we are. He passed away in July 26th of 18. So, and I grew up in Chicago, so there we have it. But because this was classified, I have a question for you, Daphne. When did you learn your father was a Tuskegee Airman? What happened and what did you learn? How old were you?
So it is kind of interesting because, again, my dad was in the military my whole life. I was born 1952 in the Philippines, and when we moved back to the States, my younger sister was born 1954, and my parents divorced late 50s, early 60s. And I just always saw this uniform. Every time I saw him, he was in a uniform. Even when he was cutting grass, he had this military jumpsuit on, and his, the military shoes shine. I mean, I just always knew that Dad was in the military, and I knew a lot of his friends. Some of them were still military, some of them were not, but I didn't understand the Tuskegee piece until I was in my late 20s. And there was a reunion here in Denver, Colorado, and I got a chance to attend it with him. And it was like, oh, okay, so this is a big deal. But it was a big deal because the guys were hanging out. I mean, it was a meeting of the men, and the men would talk about things, and I would see pictures. But until I got in my late 30s and began to read myself and understand and go through his documentation, did I understand that this was something significant that these men did. I also knew historically my mother went to Talladega, which is an all-black college. She got a full 4-year scholarship. She was out of the South. So my family is out of the South. So there was always this sort of unwritten rule about behavior and what you did as a young lady and how you behaved and how you acted. And the fact that there were times that we might be the only Black family at an officers club or at a particular event, you just knew that there was something that was going on, but I didn't know the full thrust of that Tuskegee experiment. And what I would sometimes also have to do once I began to learn was also say, this is not the syphilis experiment, this is the military experiment, and help people understand that those were two separate things, because there was always that confusion.
Yeah.
But I was probably in my mid-30s when I began to actually see his documentation, see the booklets and the information that he would get from going to these conferences, and beginning to understand that some of his buddies, some of the friends I grew up with, their dads were Tuskegee Airmen. I just knew my mom was a teacher, my dad was military. Everybody's parents were teachers and military. And until I sort of separated, oh, this is a big deal. These are people that did these specific things. So I'd say probably my mid-30s when I really grasped the Tuskegee piece.
Okay. That's interesting, because I will never forget when I learned, because my mom was a teacher, my dad was an engineer, he had finished our basement, I was in 3rd grade, and he built cubbies and a place for us to study and put all our toys. And so there were 5 of them, and I was, Dad, what are you gonna put in your cubby? And my mother is nudging him, saying, you need to tell them. And he was somewhat reluctant, and she finally told him, if you don't tell them, I'm gonna tell them. So when you leave tonight, take a look at that map back there. What my dad showed us and told us about was his time being a Tuskegee Airman, that he had been a pilot in World War II, that he had fought overseas, that he was a Tuskegee Airman. Now, Tuskegee Airmen as such didn't ring a bell, but I went to school the next Monday, and I'm telling all the kids in my classroom that my father was a fighter pilot in World War II. The school that I went to was segregated, but we had white teachers in there. No white students, but white teachers. So the teacher comes up and tells everyone, she doesn't know what she's talking about. There's no such thing as Black pilots. And back then, she probably just didn't know. But because I knew, and my mom was a teacher, and I thought teachers knew everything, I said something I shouldn't have, which was like, well, then you're just stupid, because my dad was a pilot, and I saw his paper, and I saw his medals, and I saw his maps, and you just don't know what you're talking about. So I had to have a little conversation with my mother about disrespecting teachers, but I was in 3rd grade, and I was that proud that I was calling out a teacher because she didn't know that there were Black pilots. And from that point on, I kind of paid attention to the fact that, oh, and my godfather, he was in the service with you. All of my siblings, we all had an airman for a godparent. That they would meet, and my dad was the editor of this little newsletter that they had, because they were still meeting then, and they would send out newsletters and say, come to meetings, we need to talk about this. And the Chicago chapter retained the name the Dodo, so they're called the Dodo chapter because of that. But even though my mother forced him in that sense to tell us, that he'd been an airman, you had to pull it out of him. He just didn't talk about it. He didn't say it's because it's supposed to be classified. He just didn't talk about it. But I think part of that was just there is an era of men. You went to war because that's what you were supposed to do for your country. And so that's what he did. But then later on, I would say there was an incident where, raise your hand, did anybody, the Scott O'Grady incident, anybody remember that? Scott O'Grady was in the Air Force. He got shot down in a place called Avignon, Italy. He was on the news because he parachuted out, bundled up, he hit his parachute, and as he described it, he ran like a bunny to get out of there. He was scared. And where he was shot down was near where Ramitelli doesn't exist as an air base anymore, but if you have maps, you can see where it was. And it was near there. So my mother called the news and said, hey, you need to come interview my husband. This is his story. So we have videos where the news came and interviewed him, and the lead headline was, if you don't think history repeats itself, wait till you hear this story. So everybody comes back from the commercial. And it was after that that Dad started talking about it much more to anyone who would listen. He was on the Speakers Bureau, and he talked about it, and he went to conventions, and he held every office in his chapter. So, yeah, as a youngster, not many of us got it. And as a matter of fact, you and I met in the early 80s on the tennis court. We didn't even talk about it until because I'm originally from Chicago, I was a member of that chapter, but then my dad was like, well, you're really in Denver, you should join that chapter. And I was like, what are you doing here? And that's how we knew that we had something else in common besides tennis. So
And skiing.
And skiing, that's true. So what did you learn about your father's role in terms of what he did during World War II?
So, again, Daddy was the class of 1942I. He flew 60 missions, and coming back to the States, he actually taught ROTC at Howard and taught aviation training at Howard University for a while. And that's why my second older sister was born in Washington, D.C. One of the and in the Philippines, he was just one of the commanders, one of the office commanders. Coming back to the United States, and I hope I articulate this correctly. So after World War II, there were several installations that did the filing, the personnel filing for the military coming in and out of the military, male and female. And they needed an other location, and there was a building that the hospital, I think the city and county of Denver, or the hospital owned, that was at 38th and York. And it became the original Air Force Personnel Finance Center at 38th and York. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Northeast Denver, and this is a little further north than, it's north of 5 Points, but west of what is Park Hill. And there was, so if you know where City Park is, at the golf course at 26th, and you go north, that whole Northeast Denver pocket from Downing to about Colorado Boulevard was just shy of what they called redlining. Black folks could only live in certain sections of town. And in 1953, 54 is when we moved to Denver. My parents were still married at that time. And he was one of the first officers at that personnel center. And we lived at 3610 St. Paul. And and I lost my train of thought. What was the question again?
Oh, the question was, and so kind of, what did you learn about what your father had actually done during
So
the war?
one of the
But-
things that he did was, as an instructor, he was instructing some of these young men who would come in, but as the officer at the finance center, he was in charge of making sure payroll was done, and that these young men and women who were coming in and out of the military, their personnel records got cleared and were filed. Then he got sent to Korea for a while, and then came back to the States and was at the Air Force, the Federal Center, rather, I'm sorry, the Federal Center at 6th and Sims, and then in '65 retired a colonel. But a lot of his career was around personnel management. That's what his degree, his master's degree was in personnel management. And so that's what a lot of his career was. And then moving to San Francisco and becoming very heavily involved with the Bay Area San Francisco chapter and with the Bureau of Customs, he actually was the, let's see if I say this word, arbiter for the mint here in Colorado when there was a labor dispute. And I want to say that was late 60s, maybe early 70s when that took place. Some of you may remember that stint a little better. But he was always in personnel management and always trying to help young men get through this military thing.
Well, I'm going to quickly say my dad flew 64 missions, and he got out of the service because he had been shot down. He was missing for 6 weeks, made his way back without getting captured, and because he was down and his plane with his markings were down, they said, well, you can stay, but we really want you to go back to the States because the Germans in particular have way more intelligence on us than we have on them. So they know who you are, where you lived, where your family lived. They can probably tell you what high school you went to and what your home address is. So he ended up coming out, and as I said, he designed street lighting systems. But I want to get to 2 quick questions so we can have some time for the audience to interact. Tell me your favorite story from your dad about his time in the military, and what's the best lesson you think, looking at your life now, what's the best lesson you learned from your dad?
One of the ironies is that, again, they really didn't talk a lot about it. But I know that it was just so important to him, the camaraderie. Just the guys were his lifeline. They go golfing. He had 4 girls, no sons, and so we played tennis. He even tried to teach me how to fish, and I wasn't working for that one. But I learned to ice skate before I learned to roller skate. I mean, it was just that sports thing was in him. He played football, basketball, baseball in college. And so again, we were the Army. The 4 girls were the Army to him. But the life lesson was just the discipline. To this day, I drive my sisters crazy because I'm always getting up early and making them come on time to do stuff. There's only 2 of us that are still in Denver. The rest of them, Chicago and DC. And they are still very active with the Tuskegee chapters in their state. But just the discipline. You know, if you didn't do it right, it's okay, do it again, be honest about it, confess that you did it wrong, and, and just do it again. But just integrity just the integrity that these men had and that my dad had.
Yeah. I think I have a similar story. I mean, my favorite story was him talking about being shot down on a mission that he volunteered for. He wasn't even supposed to be in rotation. He volunteered, and he ended up getting shot down on a strafing mission. And the important part of the story is after he bailed out finally, his plane was on fire, runs away, he's hiding in a field where there are cows and there's a farmhouse across the way, and he's catching his breath and trying to decide, are these gonna be friendly or are these gonna be enemy folks? And as he's standing there, a little white boy walked around the front of the cow, looked at him and said, "You American, me partisan." Because my dad said his heart caught in his throat. He had to fight this war for this country, and nobody here called him an American. So that was kind of my favorite story of how, yeah, he did the right thing even when it didn't matter. It mattered to someone else. And probably the life lesson was there's a lot of discipline, absolutely right, and do it right. But he came from a family where he passed this on, not in a negative way, but the family motto was, you're getting an education, so failure is not an option. If it doesn't work the first time, figure it out and make it happen. And I think that lesson has served me well. Just never quit. Figure it out and make it happen. Just hang in there and make it happen.
I want to tag on that. It's growing up it was never a question. You were going from 6th grade to 7th grade. You were going from junior high school to high school. You were going to college. We didn't care where, but you were going. There were these kinds of unwritten expectations. You were going to do this, and you were going to do that. And even if you didn't succeed, you did it once so that you could say you did it.
Yeah. I understand that, and I think that came from what they went through. Yes. And what they learned and what they had to do to survive and take care of their families. So thank you for sharing your stories with us.
Thank you.
And
thank you for asking me.
At this time, we wanted to make sure we left time for questions. Hopefully there's some curiosity out there about something. He's going to bring you a mic.
Yes. Okay. What I was going to ask, in 1949, they had the Top Gun contest, and they won it as a team. And it seems like we never heard about another Top Gun contest where the 332nd was involved. After they won that, were they like kind of banned from it because of the fact that they didn't want them to be continual winners?
I don't know that they were banned from it, but remember, part of it was with the war over, they just started absorbing units, and I think by the time they finished, the units had been absorbed. And there was a time when the 332nd, per se, didn't exist, and the Air Force wasn't even teaching aerial dogfighting or anything. And I think it was after Vietnam, they did some assessments, and they said, and in Iraq, and they said, we are losing big time because we didn't teach that. We don't teach that anymore. And so that they started teaching dogfighting and aerial fighting. And there is now something called the 332nd Expeditionary Wing. They have a home in Alabama, but most of the time they are overseas in supportive roles. But I think going back to your question, it was the the track that was occurring where all those units were getting absorbed and changed. So, but you might be right, because you heard Colonel Harvey say they knew I was coming, so Hitler gave up. But thank you for that question. Other questions? Oh.
I don't really have a question. I came tonight knowing a thumbnail of history about the Tuskegee.
We need you to talk into the mic because of the electronic
Video.
and the video, so
Okay.
folks can make sure they get the question.
I came tonight knowing a thumbnail of the history of the Tuskegee Airmen, and that's why I wanted to come tonight to learn more, and I've learned a whole lot more, so thank you and all of the presentation. One thing that stood out to me, though, I looked at the storyboards or whatever you called these before your presentations, and I didn't think about or realize that women were part of that village that you spoke about.
Absolutely. There are women who actually flew some of the planes that the fighters ended up training on. They would fly them from factories down there. They were nurses. They worked in the office. And so for a long time, when people first started talking about it, they really were referencing the pilots. Many of the pilots said, well, you know, it wasn't just us, because if we didn't have all the administrative folks, and particularly if we didn't have the mechanics cobbling our planes together, there's no way we could have been successful. So women were definitely a part of helping to make that experiment successful. Other questions?
Did your fathers ever talk about the impact that they had on those that came after them? Not just with flying airplanes, but just in other aspects of the military that were new territory to make their own?
I would have to say yes, overall they did. So for example, when Chappie James became a four-star, you know, anybody who advanced in the military, as Daphne talks about with her father, these guys hung out together. They were there. The chapters were there. Most chapters have a color jacket, so ours is kind of a reddish burgundy. And so you go to these events and you see the chapters. They are there, front and center, in their colors, supporting each other, talking about, isn't this great? And when I said that they signed the order to desegregate the military, it was a piece of paper, because if you talk to people who've come since then, they will tell you there's still been issues. That battle continues. But certainly the airmen show up, pay attention to who's doing what, support in that video, which maybe we can get playing again, in the public spaces. You know, they name an airport. We're going to be there so that we know. They're going to name a street. They're going to name a school. Tomorrow for Lieutenant Colonel Mosley, they're naming here in Aurora one of their community clinics after him. And he's one of the airmen who is actually from Denver, from Colorado. So yeah, they talk about it, they support each other, they would turn out. Part of their conventions were having not only the Tuskegee Airmen there, but having the ROTC units there, having the Air Force, as it were, support their programs and have luncheons. And most of what they do and why the organizations exist is to give out scholarship money to deserving students who are going on to college in what is now STEM, STEAM, but students who needed financial help. That's what all the chapters are about. That's what their fundraisers are about. So when y'all see our stuff for our golf tournament this summer, come out and play golf, support the students. So yes, they talk about that, and they want to make sure the legacy isn't forgotten. And part of their, what do you call it? Their saying, there's a term,
Motto.
their motto is giving the past a future. So they're very aware of and focused on how do we make sure that it's better for others, and what we did means something.
I know each chapter in most states. My younger sister is very active with the Dodo chapter in San Francisco and Chicago still, and they also have scholarship kinds of things. They is very big, heavy on that. I'm fortunate that I actually have 3 colonels. I think one is a general that I've got their pictures that said on the bottom of their pictures, "Thank you, Colonel Rice." That my dad's training is what got them where they are. So they have a legacy. They've got a thing, a symbiotic within, and a lot of, because of so many of the originals are passing away, I know that some of the chapters are very connected to Blacks in Aviation.
Right.
That some of the other aviation schools, United Airlines, that kind of thing, are connectional with the Tuskegee chapters.
Yeah, and many of them also have some kind of flight program where they work with and support children to learn about aviation, to get flights, to fly in gliders, and then even go on to get pilot's licenses and train for, commercial pilot's licenses. So, yeah. Another question?
Oh, did you? Oh.
Thank you.
And then we have a gentleman up
Up
front
front,
who's
okay.
been waiting for that microphone. So we'll take
Yes.
him and then we see you.
Thank you. I had a question. You wanted to bring up the map in the back. Could you explain the detail of that map? That
Oh,
says
okay.
circles and it's outlined in red.
Yeah. So
Thank you.
so that map was one of my dad's maps. He's got red markings on it, kind of showing the territories where they would fly. There's a Z on there, which stands for Zagreb. At that time, it was part of Yugoslavia. That's where he was shot down. Their base was actually, as I'm looking at it, so it would be on, and as you look at it, was actually over to the left, Ramatelli, but most of their missions were 200 to 300 miles from Ramatelli. The reenactor, John, talked about this mission up to Berlin. That was an 8-hour mission. They had to change take some of the, it was always, let me put it this way, it was always a question of what can we do with this plane to accomplish the mission? So sometimes they would add fuel tanks, which they had to do to get to Berlin because it was a little bit beyond the scope of that plane without adding fuel tanks. Other times, they were shorter missions. They could take off some of those fuel tanks and add bombs. So that's kind of why he put all those red marks. You can't see it, but I'll turn it over since I've talked about it. When he was shot down, he ended up finding his way to an Allied mission that was run by the English that helped down American and Allied pilots. And so on the back, he has notes like of what happened on this day. I finally saw the doctor and they told me I had pulled muscles in my back and that sort of thing. So it doesn't make sense to just have the other side out because you asked. But I'll turn it over or you can walk behind and you can see those are his actual handwritten notes of what was going on in that area. And this gentleman up front, we got a mic for you.
Thank you. Those of us that's free and accepted. Those of us who are free and accepted Masons, Daniel Chappie James Jr. Military Lodge, number 26, in Aurora is after the first black 4-star general in the Air Force. So I just want to let that be known that Daniel Chappie James, whose picture in the back, is named after our military lodge.
Okay, and you said you're a Mason. I need to talk to you about something before you leave, please.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Other questions? Here's one over here.
So I noticed in some of the pictures that are coming up in the back, and they'll have the names of one of the airmen, but they don't say, they'll say Lieutenant, you know, and they'll have his name, but they're not putting that they were part of the Tuskegee. Does that fall under that classified piece? Because if I weren't here and seeing it, not all of them say why this library was named after him or why this highway. Is that just due to the battle that we continue to fight, or is it just the way they choose to do it?
No, that's because this is a work in progress. But it literally is. What I tried to do was have a slide. So Omar Blair, and there's a little bio of him. And then there's a school and a library, the research library, Blair Caldwell downtown, named after him. But thank you for that, because that tells me I need to add a little more information at the bottom so people will know. Does that answer?
I don't yet know it does, but I don't think it's you. I just think like when there was, if you were to go through, I could tell you there was a slide with one of the names, but they didn't say why his name was there. They just said Lieutenant.
Let me see if I can.
Okay.
Can I overtake this and scroll? No. He's got it on a timer.
I'll just tell you when I see it.
Let's go up. Keep going up. So, like,
Number 10?
start here. So, yeah, so this talks about Omar Blair, and it tells you something about him. And then in public places, he has this charter school in Denver named after him.
Right. I've actually been in that school.
Okay, and then the library. And so you're trying to tell me I need some more information.
So that it's clear that he was a Tuskegee Airman.
Yeah, the recognition is what I would love to see, is that Omar D. Blair School, and then not necessarily to have a plaque. I just was questioning, not fault of you, just I didn't know if it was just like they only allowed you this much, or we just aren't gonna, we can't put Tuskegee out, is what I assumed I would hear you say. That's what it was.
Oh,
But
okay, I see. No, and I can fix that. So this is good feedback for making this a better slide pack.
okay.
Okay, thank you for that.
Thank you, Gabrielle.
No limitations.
Yeah, no. That's why I say it's a work in progress, but I get feedback and then I can improve it so it's more understandable, people get more out of it, because otherwise it's useless, right?
If they see Tuskegee, maybe those that don't know about it, they'll reach out to do more research, and then we continue the education is what I was.
Okay. We can do that. We got one back here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here tonight. It's been really fascinating. I appreciate it, and I thank the DEI Commission for putting it together as well. It's been terrific, and thank you for your reenactment. You really did embody the spirit. I think that was remarkable. So we As I mentioned to you before it began that my husband had walked in on a gathering of Tuskegee Airmen in 2005 at the Proud Bird outside of LAX, and he really wished he could be here tonight, but he can't because he's sick. I was wondering if you had seen the film Red Tails, and if it resembles the experience that your dad's told you about and that you've heard about since.
You want to start, or do you want me to start? How many times is the question?
So actually, the original Tuskegee Airmen with Lawrence Fishburne, my father was one of the original contributors. By the time the other Red Tail had come out, my father had passed away by then. But because it's television or TV, there's always this sensational piece about it. I'd say maybe a third-ish, maybe close to half, was accurate in that these are the men and these are some of the situations, but how the situations evolved can be disputed, I guess, is how they evolved.
Yeah. So the original Tuskegee Airmen movie, my father was a stickler for accuracy.
Yeah.
So he just, I was tired of listening to him complain, I'll say. Because, for example, the scene where the guy gets kicked out and he knows he's kicked out and he somehow gets a plane and he goes up and crashes it.
yeah.
My dad's like, that would never happen. He would
Yes,
just be
that's true.
escorted off. He would be nowhere near any equipment or people or guns or anything like that. So there were things like that put in, sensationalism for Hollywood to sell a movie that he didn't like. He was much happier with Red Tails. He thought there was more accuracy to that. I did not hear nearly the number of complaints. It might have been because he was just that much older and tired of complaining. I don't know. But he and I think he did enjoy Red Tails, much more than the first one. But nonetheless, he has both of them in his video collection. And it was always something he could talk about with he has two grandsons, and would talk about with the chapter when he would get, he was part of the Speakers Bureau in Chicago, so he would talk about them a lot. And, one of the things I said at the beginning was, we tell stories. Sometimes we just make them up. Sometimes it's to give a perspective. And at the end of the day, we hope there's some accuracy there and we can use the stories to preserve history. But, as they say, history is one of those eye of the beholder things.
If you can get a hold, I think it's on
Put that
YouTube.
closer to you.
I think it's on YouTube, Double Victory.
Yeah.
That one is a really good documentary that gives more meat and realization. It's called Double Victory.
And that's done by the same, what's his name, that did Red Tails, isn't it?
Lucas? Is
Yeah,
it Lucas?
Lucasfilms.
Lucasfilms,
Yeah.
yes.
Thank you.
Thanks again, and I would like to thank our Miss Gabrielle and you as well for coming and the presentation that John did as well. And I really want to thank all of our veterans as well that are in the audience, and want to thank everyone for coming out tonight and the DEI Commission members. And like I said, once again, Doreen, I appreciate it for making this happen, and hope everyone has a blessed and wonderful night. Unfortunately, from hearing these stories, our struggle still lives on. You would not believe how many people today are still facing these situations. My father, for example, grew up on a on a plantation as well. So just wanted to thank everyone else. Talk to people, know your history, and know what's going on. So thanks a lot, and I want to thank everyone watching and on TV as well, and have a blessed night and drive home safely.
Yeah. And again, thank you for having us. We hope you enjoyed the program.